Abandoned to a blizzard with her newborn, a desperate woman is rescued by a reclusive rancher haunted by his own past. As a savage, undeniable passion ignites between them in the isolated cabin, the man she fled returns with a vengeance, forcing them to fight for a future they never dared to dream of, a future that must be bought with blood and fire. The shotgun blast was the only sound that could tear the world apart more thoroughly than the blizzard had. It was a roar of thunder in the heart of the storm. But the sound didn't come from the devil in the doorway. It came from the shadows behind him. He staggered, a strangled cry ripped from his throat, his face a mask of disbelief as a dark flower bloomed on his shoulder. He turned, his eyes wild, and there she was, Elara, the woman he had discarded like trash. No longer the broken thing he'd left to freeze in the snow, but a pillar of ice and righteous fire, a rifle held steady in her hands, its barrel still smoking. Looming over the fallen man was Jedediah, his own fists clenched, his body a promise of brutal violence held back by a thread of iron will. The air crackled, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, pine-scented wood smoke, and something else. A raw, possessive energy that bound Elara and Jedediah together in the chaos. His eyes met hers over the man bleeding in the snow, a silent, burning question passing between them. This was no longer just about survival. It was about the savage, desperate love that had taken root in the heart of a storm. A love that had just drawn its first blood. And as the blizzard raged on, a mere echo of the tempest inside the cabin, it was clear the fight for their lives had only just begun. Part 1. The Ghost of the Storm. The wind was a living entity, a predator with teeth of ice, and a voice that screamed with the fury of 1,000 lost souls. It clawed at Elara, tearing through the thin, threadbare cloak that was her only shield against its relentless assault. Each step was a battle, a desperate plunge into a churning sea of white that sought to swallow her whole. Her boots, soaked through and torn, offered no purchase, sinking deep into the frozen earth with a soundless finality. The Montana wilderness, a place Silas had promised would be their paradise, had become her tomb. Her newborn son, a life so new he didn't even have a name, was a fragile weight against her chest. He was a flickering candle flame, and she was the cupped hands, trembling and failing, trying to shield him from the gale. Her own life force was draining away with every agonizing step, every shuddering breath that frosted in the air before her. Blood, her own lifeblood from a birth that felt like a lifetime ago, was a frozen, brittle stain on her skirts. A grim, crimson reminder of the moment her life had shattered. His name was Silas, a name that had once tasted like honey and summertime promises on her tongue. It had meant safety, a future, a home filled with light and laughter. She remembered the smooth charm in his voice as he spun tales of the land had bought, the cabin he would build with his own 2 hands, the life they would create under the vast Montana sky. He'd wooed her in Nebraska, painted a picture so vivid she could feel the warmth of the hearth, hear the laughter of their future children. She had given him everything, her trust, her body, her heart. Now, his name was a curse, a shard of ice in her soul. He had watched her labor in the back of their rickety wagon, his handsome face twisting not with concern, but with a chilling, reptilian disgust. A disgrace, he'd hissed, the words more cutting than the wind. Coming early, making a mess of things. His grand promises of marriage, of a respected life, had turned to ash in his mouth. He'd vanished before the sun had a chance to rise, a coward slinking away in the pre-dawn gloom. He'd taken the mule, the last of the food, even her sturdy winter boots, leaving her with his cast-off rags. He left her with their child and a death sentence, not even gracing her with a backward glance. Her fingers, protruding from torn gloves, were the color of lead, devoid of feeling. Her lips were cracked and blue, every breath a searing pain in her lungs. The baby let out a cry, not a robust wail, but a tiny, pathetic shiver of sound that broke the last fragile remnants of her heart. "Hush now, my love," she wept, the tears instantly freezing to her lashes, stinging her cheeks. "Mama's here. Mama has you." The lie was a bitter acid on her tongue. This was it. The end. She was a ghost already, haunting the landscape of her own demise. Then, her legs, numb and useless, finally gave way. She collapsed into a deep snowdrift with a soft, muffled thud, her last conscious thought to curl her body around the precious, warm bundle in her arms. "Just let go," a seductive voice whispered in the deepest parts of her mind. "It would be so easy. Let the white silence take you. Let the cold be your final blanket." It was a tempting peace. No more pain. No more fear. No more shame. But as oblivion beckoned, a new sound pierced the storm's monolithic howl. It was not the wind. It was a rhythmic, powerful beat. A sound of life and strength tearing through the deadening white. Hoofbeats. Heavy, determined, impossibly close. A shape materialized from the swirling curtain of snow, a creature of myth in the desolate landscape. A massive black horse, its coat dusted with white, snorting great plumes of steam into the frigid air. A figure dismounted, a giant of a man wrapped in a long, dark duster that billowed around him like the wings of a dark angel. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, heavy with snow, but his presence was an undeniable force, a mountain of solid reality in her dissolving world. He loomed over her, casting a shadow that felt, impossibly, like a shield. "Ma'am," his voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep within the earth. It was a voice that held power, not of cruelty, but of absolute authority. "Are you alive?" Alara couldn't form words. Her jaw was frozen shut. She could only perform one last, desperate act. With the last ounce of her will, she held out the bundled child, her arm trembling violently. The man moved with a startling fluid quickness, kneeling beside her in the deep snow. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, sharp and intensely focused, took in the entire horrific scene in a single glance. The frozen woman, the impossibly small infant, the bloodstain on her skirt. There was no pity in his gaze, but something far more potent, a flash of raw, savage fury. In one swift, decisive motion, he shrugged off his heavy, wool-lined duster coat. It was a magnificent gesture of pure, instinctual protection. He wrapped it around them both, cocooning them in a world of worn leather, warm wool, and the shocking, life-giving heat of his own body. The scent of him, pine smoke, horse, and something uniquely, elementally male, filled her senses, a scent of life in the midst of death. His hands, calloused and scarred from hard labor, were impossibly gentle as he gathered them up from their snowy grave. "God Almighty," he muttered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Awe, anger, reverence. He lifted her as if she were a child, her weight nothing to his powerful frame. "You were about to meet your maker." As he carried her toward his horse, his stride sure and steady even in the deep snow, Alara felt a tremor pass through his body. It wasn't a shiver from the cold. It was a deep, controlled rage, a fury directed not at her, but at the world, at the man, at the fate that had allowed this to happen. His arm tightened around her, a possessive, protective gesture. "Don't you worry," he said, his voice softening. The rumble becoming a vow whispered against her hair. "I have you now." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Alara closed her eyes and surrendered. She let herself believe it. She gave in to the impossible strength of this stranger, to the shocking heat of his coat, and to the wild, terrifying flicker of a new feeling taking root in her frozen heart. A desperate, primal pull toward the man who had just snatched her and her son from the jaws of death itself. Part 2. A shelter of skin and smoke. The warmth of the cabin was an immediate, violent assault. It was a physical blow, sharp and almost painful against her frozen skin, forcing the air from her lungs in a ragged gasp. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, its solid thud cutting off the storm's screaming howl as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden silence was as profound as the warmth. Alara's vision swam, a disorienting blur of dancing firelight, the dark, reassuring lines of rough-hewn logs, and the grounding scent of pine, wood smoke, and man. The man, Jedediah, moved with a predator's contained grace, fast but careful, laying her down on a worn cot near the hearth as if she were made of spun glass and might shatter at the slightest jostle. His coat, was still wrapped around her and the baby, a heavy, fragrant shield. It was a second skin that smelled of leather, the outdoors, and an untamed strength that was purely intoxicatingly him. Her body, now realizing it was safe, betrayed her. She was racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might break. The baby, roused by the sudden change, began to whimper, a hungry, searching sound that was a knife in her heart. Jedediah knelt beside her. His large, capable hands hovered over her for a moment, hesitant, as if he were unsure where to touch, as if touching her would be a transgression. The sight of his uncertainty, in a man so clearly defined by strength, was strangely endearing. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice now a low, calming rumble that seemed to vibrate right through the cot and into her bones. It was a voice that commanded you to listen, to trust. "I'm going to get you both warm. You just hang on." Alara's lips moved, but only a broken, breathy sound escaped. Her arms, acting on pure animal instinct, tightened their hold on her son. Jedediah saw the motion, and a look of profound, almost pained understanding crossed his rugged features. "You're safe," he promised again. And this time the words were not just a vow, but an unbreakable oath spoken into the warm, firelit air. He worked with a quiet, intense urgency that was mesmerizing to watch. He stoked the fire until it roared, the flames leaping up the chimney. He fetched blankets from a wooden chest. They were worn and faded, but clean and smelled of cedar. He moved around the small, masculine space with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived alone. He poured hot, weak broth from a pot on the stove into a tin cup. He brought it to her, kneeling again, and held it to her lips. His thumb brushed against her chin to steady the cup, and a jolt of pure heat shot through her that had nothing to do with the broth. It was a spark on frozen tinder. Slowly, he commanded softly, his stormy eyes never leaving hers. The warmth of the liquid spread through her, a blessed fire chasing away the deep internal cold. And then, she wept. Not from pain or fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of this man's kindness. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. The baby's cries grew more insistent. Jedediah didn't panic. He simply rose, moved to a small cabinet, and retrieved a glass bottle with a rubber nipple. "Goat's milk," he explained, his gaze steady. "My mare lost her foal last week. It's fresh." With a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior, he gently took the baby from Alara's arms. She felt a momentary pang of loss, an instinct to cling, but it was immediately replaced by awe. He held her son in the crook of one powerful arm as if he'd been doing it his entire life. He fed the tiny, desperate mouth with a focus so complete, so reverent, it was breathtaking. He was a man of the wilderness, as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. Yet here he was, tending to a strange woman's child with a devotion that made her very soul ache. "Alara?" she managed to whisper when he finally asked her name, her voice raw and unused. "Jedediah," he replied, his gaze intense. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't need one. In this small, warm cabin, adrift in a sea of white, they were just a man and a woman, stripped down to their most essential selves. Later, after she was dressed in a dry, soft flannel shift he'd found for her, she watched him from the cot. He had taken the rocking chair, not speaking, just staring into the flames, the firelight carving canyons and ridges into his strong, weathered face. The silence wasn't empty or awkward. It was charged, heavy with the unspoken reality of her rescue, her past, and the dangerous magnetic current of awareness that flowed between them. "He left me," she said finally, the words tearing from her throat, raw and ugly in the quiet room. Jedediah's head snapped up. His eyes were like chips of flint in the firelight. "The baby's father?" She nodded, the shame a hot brand on her soul. The story, now that the dam was broken, spilled out of her. The lies, the voyage from Nebraska, the phantom cabin, the panic in Silas' eyes when her labor began early. "He said I was ruined," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He took the mule, the food, even my boots. He didn't even look back." Jedediah's jaw was a line of granite. He didn't offer empty platitudes or pitying glances. He just listened, his stillness a form of witness, honoring her pain by not trying to fix it. When she was done, her voice a mere thread of sound, he spoke, his own voice a low, threatening growl. "That's not your shame to carry, Alara. That shame belongs to him. A man who walks away from his own blood is less than a man. He's the one who deserves to freeze to death out there," he said. He said if I followed him, he'd make sure I was never found. Jedediah's eyes darkened to the color of a thunderhead. He rose in one fluid motion and went to the fireplace, poking the embers with a controlled violence. His broad back was a fortress between her and the storm. "If he comes looking," he said, his voice deadly quiet, his words hanging in the air like smoke, "he'll find me first." Alara stared at his unmoving back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He owed her nothing. He didn't even know her. Yet, in the space of a few hours, he had placed himself between her and her past like an unshakable shield. A terrifying, beautiful, and fiercely possessive heat bloomed in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a wild, desperate female response to the wild, protective spirit of the man before her. She was no longer just surviving. She was being defended, and it felt dangerously, thrillingly like being claimed. Part 3. The Shadow on the Ridge. The storm broke by morning, skulking away to leave the world bruised and silent under a low, heavy ceiling of gray cloud. Jedediah had been gone before she'd woken, his presence replaced by a newly stoked fire and a pot of something savory simmering over the flames. When she looked out the cabin's small window, she saw him. He was a distant, dark figure, moving near the tree line, his rifle a familiar and constant extension of his arm. He moved with the patience of a wolf, his eyes sweeping the vast, white expanse for any track that didn't belong, for any sign of the evil that had delivered her to his doorstep. Alara watched him, her son sleeping soundly on her chest, their mingled breath fogging the cold glass. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of impossible warmth and safety. But she knew the world outside was still waiting, holding its breath. Silas was out there somewhere. A man like him didn't just disappear. His kind of evil was patient. When Jedediah returned, he brought the sharp, clean scent of the cold in with him, stomping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. "No tracks," he stated, his voice flat, his gaze sweeping over her and the baby, a quick assessing look that made her feel both protected and scrutinized. No trouble, yet. That single ominous word, yet hung in the air between them, a ticking clock counting down to an unknown confrontation. He ladled some of the thick stew into a bowl for her. As he handed it to her, his calloused fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, a stark jolt of life against the lingering chill in her bones. For a man who lived in such isolation, his touch was a language all its own. "You live out here all alone?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The silence of the cabin was so complete, it was hard to imagine it ever being filled with voices. He leaned his broad shoulders against the rough-hewn wall, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. A ghost of a smile, dry and cynical, touched his lips. "Bought the land a few years back. Thought I was looking for quiet." He paused, his gaze turning inward for a moment. Turns out silence has a lot to say when it's the only company you keep. His expression grew serious again, his stormy gaze locking with hers, pinning her in place. "But I wasn't expecting you." A hot flush crept up Alara's neck. She looked down at the swirling stew in her bowl. "I wasn't expecting to be here." "Where would you have gone, Alara?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent, refusing to let her hide. "If I hadn't found you?" She had to be honest with him. He deserved that much. Nowhere, she admitted, her voice hollow. The river, maybe. I think I just would have walked until I couldn't anymore. I stopped choosing after he left me. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. She had bared the ugliest part of her soul the moment she had given up. She expected him to look away, to shift uncomfortably. Instead, he pushed off the wall and came closer, taking the rocking chair opposite her cot. "I know that place," he said finally, his voice rough with a memory he rarely visited. The edge of nothing, a different winter, a different reason. Same kind of dark. Alara looked up, startled. His eyes held no pity, only the stark, bleak reflection of her own past despair. He wasn't looking down at her from a position of strength. He was meeting her gaze as an equal, a fellow traveler from the underworld. "What stopped you?" she whispered. "My sister's boy," he said, his gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames, showed up on my doorstep one morning. Just 10 years old. His father, my brother-in-law, had finally let the bottle win, drank himself into an early grave. The story came out in clipped, hard sentences, like stones being pulled from a deep well. My sister had passed a year prior. The boy had nowhere else to go. He walked 20 miles to find me. He needed someone. The admission was stark, a piece of his soul laid bare for her to see. "Is he still with you?" Jedediah shook his head, a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "Got taken in by an uncle with a wife and a proper home down in Idaho. It was better for him. But he made it. And I guess," he added, his eyes finding hers again, "the connection a tangible thing. I did too." The fire crackled, casting light and shadow on the scarred wooden walls. In that moment, the space between them shrank to nothing. He wasn't just her rescuer. He was a fellow survivor, a man who understood the precipice she had been so brutally pulled from. Her gaze drifted to the window, drawn by some unseen premonition, and her blood ran cold. "The stew turned till she whispered. Her voice then, he whispered." He didn't ask questions. He moved with the instantaneous, lethal speed of a striking snake. The rifle was in his hands, his body instantly alert and coiled as he moved to the door. "How many?" "Just one. A man on a horse." Jedediah stared through the small glass pane, his muscles bunched and tense under his flannel shirt. The rider was a stark black silhouette against the slate-gray sky. Too far to see a face, but his very presence was a violation. An act of aggression. "Could be a lost traveler," Jedediah said. But his tone was devoid of belief. "Or it could be your past coming to call." Alara's breath hitched in her throat. The man on the ridge sat motionless, still as a carrion bird waiting for a sign of weakness. Jedediah turned to her, his face a mask of cold, deadly resolve. "If it's him," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with promise, "he'll wish he'd stayed lost in the storm." A tremor went through Alara, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was a surge of something else, something fierce and hot and unfamiliar. Watching Jedediah, seeing the absolute, lethal certainty in his eyes, she didn't feel like prey. She felt like she was standing beside a wolf, and the hunter had just foolishly wandered into their territory. A wild, possessive, and utterly terrifying thrill shot through her. Let him come. Let Silas see the man who had found her. Let him see what she had found in the storm. Part 4. A line drawn in snow. The rider on the ridge became a fixture, a silent, ominous statue against the bruised sky. He remained for hours, a psychological weight, a constant pressure that seeped into the very logs of the cabin. He didn't approach. He didn't signal. He just watched. It was a war of nerves, and Alara found herself watching Jedediah as much as the man outside. Jedediah moved with a contained, lethal energy. His calm was more unsettling than any outburst of anger. His rifle was a constant companion, leaning against the wall, resting on the table, never more than an arm's length away. "Is it him?" he asked again that afternoon, his voice a low murmur beside her as they both stood near the window, partially concealed by the shadows. She strained her eyes, trying to will the distant figure into focus. "The hat," she whispered, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and fury. "It's bent at the crown, on the left side, just like his. He was kicked by a horse once." Jedediah nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. His jaw was set like iron. "Then we don't wait for him to make the first move. We set the terms." That evening, as twilight bled across the snow in shades of purple and gray, Jedediah lit several lanterns, but he didn't hang them for light. He walked the perimeter of the small clearing around the cabin, placing them at intervals, their warm, defiant glow pushing back against the encroaching darkness. They were symbols. They were warnings. They were a clear, unambiguous statement. Someone lives here. Someone watches. Someone is ready. He was drawing a line in the snow, a boundary between the sanctuary he had created and the evil that lurked beyond it. He was daring the shadow on the ridge to cross it. As she fed her son by the hearth, the rhythmic sucking sound a small anchor in a sea of tension, her hands trembled. "He's a coward, Jedediah," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "He preys on the weak, the alone. He won't come if he knows I'm not alone." Jedediah was meticulously cleaning his rifle, the sharp, metallic clicks punctuating the quiet room. He paused and looked at her, his stormy eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "He won't find you alone," he said, the words not a promise, but a simple, profound statement of fact. "Not ever again." The raw possessiveness in his voice, the sheer intensity of his gaze, made her heart pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This went far beyond charity, far beyond the kindness of a stranger. This was a man staking a claim, defending his territory, and she, somehow, had become the heart of it. "You don't know him," she insisted, a desperate need for him to understand the true nature of the man they faced. "He'll twist everything. He'll tell you I'm a liar, a thief. He'll smile while he does it. He'll say the child isn't his, is it?" Jedediah asked, his voice level, cutting through her frantic words. "Yes," she said, the word like sharp, cut glass. "And I only ran from him after he tried to sell me to another man, a trapper with a missing eye, to pay a gambling debt had accrued." The rag in Jedediah's hand stilled. He slowly, deliberately, set the rifle components on the table. The muscles in his jaw worked, and the firelight cast his face in hard, unforgiving lines. He stood up, and his sheer size seemed to fill the small cabin, displacing the very air. "Then," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl, "I reckon he's the one who should be running." Sleep was a shallow, fleeting thing that night. Alara lay with her son, listening to the quiet sounds of Jedediah moving through the cabin, a floorboard creaking under his weight, the soft thud of another log on the fire, the whisper of oil on a cloth. He was a guardian in the dark, a sleepless protector whose presence was a comfort more profound than any blanket. Just before dawn, she looked out the window. The ridge was empty. The relief that washed over her was immediate, but short-lived. In the pale gray light of the new day, she saw them. Fresh boot prints in the snow below the ridge, leading from the tree line to the edge of the clearing, and then back again. And something else. Something small and dark lying in the snow. Jedediah retrieved it, his face grim. It was a black hat, torn at the crown on the left side. Silas had left a calling card. He held it for a long moment before turning to her, his eyes blazing with cold fury. "He's not gone," he said quietly. "He's testing the fences. He's playing a game. He thinks we're afraid." Jedediah wasn't afraid. He was angry. And looking at him, Alara found her own fear being burned away by a cold, rising rage. The next afternoon, Jedediah brought out a second rifle, shorter and older than his own, and laid it on the table before her. "Can you shoot?" Her fingers, no longer numb with cold but trembling with nerves, touched the cool, worn wood of the stock. "My father taught me, a long time ago, to hunt rabbits. It'll come back to you," he said. He moved to stand behind her, his body a warm, solid presence at her back, boxing her in. He adjusted her grip on the rifle, his large, calloused hands completely covering hers. The heat from his body soaked into her, and his breath was a warm whisper on her neck. "He'll expect you to be a frightened do. He'll expect you to hide behind me. That's how you win. You show him the hell he unleashed when he left you in that snow." She looked up at him over her shoulder, her fear hopelessly tangled with a fierce, rising desire that stole her breath. "You're not sending me away." His eyes softened, a flicker of raw, unguarded emotion in their stormy depths. "I don't send people away, Alara," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate growl that was meant only for her. "Especially not the ones who've been thrown out by the world." He didn't move away. He stayed there, his heat enveloping her. His scent, that intoxicating mix of pine, leather, and man, filling her senses. It was a promise, a brand, a claiming. In that moment, holding the rifle, with his body shielding hers, a weapon in her hands and a warrior at her back, Alara knew she would kill for this man. She would die for this man. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty that thrilled her to her core, that he would do the same for her. Part 5. Trial by Fire. The quiet of the following day was a lie. It was the taut, humming silence of a stretched wire, the held breath before a scream. Jedediah had been scouting the perimeter since before dawn, his face a granite mask of concentration. He returned mid-morning, not with relief, but with grim news that solidified their fears. "Smoke," he said, his voice tight as he shrugged off his duster. "A mile out, in the timberline. He's made a camp." Alara's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. The game was escalating. "He's not just watching anymore." "No," Jedediah agreed, spreading a rough, hand-drawn map of the area on the table. His finger, blunt and sure, traced the ridges and creeks. "He's here. He's waiting. For me to leave for supplies. For you to lose your nerve and run." "I'm not running," she said, her voice steady and clear, a stone dropping into a still pond. Her hand rested on the stock of the rifle that now leaned against her cot. It had become a part of her. Jedediah looked at her, truly looked at her, and a slow, fierce pride lit his eyes. It was a look that went beyond protection, beyond attraction. It was respect. He was seeing an equal, a fellow fighter. "He's an impatient man, Silas," Jedediah mused, his gaze returning to the map. "He always favors force over fear, thinks it's quicker." "He's right," she replied, her own voice hard. "Fear was yesterday. Today, I fight." A grim understanding passed between them. They spent the rest of the day in a whirlwind of focused activity, turning the small cabin into a veritable fortress. They worked like two parts of a single mind, their movements synchronized, their purpose unified. Alara helped him stack logs of firewood against the insides of the windows, reinforcing them. Jedediah poured oil into every lantern they had, positioning them along the porch and at the corners of the cabin. The baby, her sweet, innocent boy, stirred but didn't cry, as if he sensed the quiet urgency, the primal demand of survival in his mother's touch. As dusk began to fall, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow, Jedediah handed her a small leather satchel. "What's this?" she asked, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hand. "Matches, a hunting knife, and a signal flare," he said, his face grim. She looked up at him sharply, a cold dread piercing her resolve. "You think I'll need to run after all?" "No," he said, his intense gaze holding hers. "I think he'll try to use fire to flush us out. It's a coward's tactic, and he is a coward." His voice was even, practical, but with an undercurrent of deadly seriousness. "If he succeeds, if the cabin catches, I want you to take the boy and move north. Straight north. There's an old trapper's cabin a mile through the pines. It's sheltered. There's a stream. You can survive there. What about you?" she whispered, her heart clenching. "I'll stop him before it comes to that," he vowed. "This is just in case." As if summoned by his words, a new flicker of orange appeared in the distance, far brighter than a simple campfire. It grew as they watched, an angry, hungry glow against the darkening sky. Smoke, thick and black, began to drift towards them on the evening breeze. "He's pushing," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl of contempt. "He's setting the tree line on fire. He thinks we'll panic and run right into his arms." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the distant hellish glow. "Tonight he crosses the line." Elara didn't blink. She met his fiery gaze with her own. "Then let him come." Because this wasn't the same girl who had stumbled, broken and weeping, through the snow. This was a woman standing on her own ground, a rifle in her hand, with everything in the world worth fighting for sleeping peacefully in a cradle behind her. And this time she would not be the one left behind in the ashes. The sky turned a sickening apocalyptic red long before the flames reached the clearing. The air grew thick, the smell of burning pine sharp and choking. The crackle of the fire grew from a distant whisper to a constant, hungry roar. Outside, the snow hissed and steamed as the underbrush at the edge of the forest caught fire, the flames licking at the boundary of their world. Then, through the roar, came the sound they had been waiting for. Boots crunching on snow. Slow, dew. Confident. Unbelievably arrogant. Silas stepped into the ring of firelight, his coat thrown open, his shotgun slung casually over one shoulder. His face, illuminated by the fire he had set, was gleaming with a mad, triumphant light. "Elara, sweetheart," he called, his voice slick with poison. "You've made this so much harder than it needed to be. Come on out now." Jedediah stepped onto the porch, a dark silhouette against the cabin's warm light, his own rifle leveled. "That's far enough, Silas. Drop the gun, turn around and walk away." Silas laughed, a cruel grating sound that set Elara's teeth on edge. "And who in the hell are you supposed to be? Her savior? Her new prize? Did she offer you the same thing she offered me? I'm the man who's going to put you in the ground if you take another step," Jedediah said, his voice deadly calm. "She's mine," Silas roared, his mask of civility finally cracking to reveal the beast beneath. "She was never yours," Jedediah countered, his voice ringing with conviction. Silas raised his shotgun. But before he could aim, a shot exploded, not from Jedediah's rifle, but from the side of the cabin. Silas screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, staggering back as blood erupted from his shoulder. He spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elara stepped out from the deep shadows of the porch, the second rifle pressed firmly against her shoulder, smoke curling from the hot barrel. "You always did underestimate me, Silas," she said, her voice as cold and clear as a winter river. "You thought I would break. You thought I would crawl back to you." He dropped his gun, his face a mask of incandescent fury and pain, and with a guttural roar he lunged at her. Jedediah moved like a bolt of lightning. He met Silas head-on, tackling him hard into the snow. It was a brutal, primal fight. Fists flew, grunts of pain and rage filled the air. One man fought with the snarling desperation of a cornered rat. The other fought with the righteous, cold fury of a man defending his home, his woman, his world. Elara stood her ground, rifle still ready, the firelight dancing in her resolute eyes. She watched as Jedediah's superior strength and purpose won out, until Silas finally stopped moving, a bloody, broken, and unconscious heap in the snow. Jedediah rose slowly, breathing heavily, his lips split and bleeding, but his eyes blazing with victory. He looked at her through the smoke and falling ash, a look of fierce, raw, possessive pride on his face. "You didn't miss." She finally let out the breath she'd been holding, a shaky, triumphant exhale that plumed in the cold air. "I wasn't aiming to." They stood together in the eerie, crackling silence, the great fire dying behind them, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. Elara looked at her son, still sleeping peacefully inside, and then at the warrior who stood beside her, his body a shield, his heart a perfect mirror of her own. This land was theirs now. Not because he had rescued her, but because they had fought for it, bled for it, and won it. Together. Part 6. The Scars of Winter. The sheriff arrived at dawn, his tired horse stepping carefully through the patches of smoldering ash that scarred the edge of the clearing. He was a weary man, his face a road map of long winters and the troubles men create for one another. His gaze took in the scene with a practiced, assessing eye. The bound and broken form of Silas groaning on the porch, the scorched tree line, and the two figures who stood waiting for him. Elara and Jedediah. They stood side by side, rifles leaning against the cabin wall, not like criminals, but like sovereigns of their own small kingdom. "He yours?" the sheriff asked Elara, his gaze sharp but not unkind. He gestured with his chin towards Silas. She met his eyes without flinching, her spine straight, her voice clear. He was. Not anymore. The sheriff sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, and dismounted. Jedediah handed him the promissory note he'd found in Silas' saddlebag, the neatly written deal to trade Elara for a piece of land and 2 good mules. The sheriff read it, his weary face hardening into a mask of disgust. He looked from the note to the unconscious Silas, then back to Elara, a new understanding in his eyes. "I heard tell of a woman and a newborn abandoned in the blizzard," he said quietly. "Didn't think anyone could live through it." He looked at the rifle she had used, then back at her. "Didn't think they'd fight like this either." He kicked Silas's boot, earning a pained groan. "I'll see he gets to the federal court in Helena. He won't be bothering you again." As the wagon carrying Silas disappeared over the ridge, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. It wasn't an empty quiet, but a peaceful one. The quiet of an ended war. Elara looked at Jedediah, at the dark bruise blooming on his cheekbone and the split in his lip. He was looking at her, his stormy eyes filled with a fierce tenderness that made her heart ache. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "No," she said with stark honesty. The adrenaline finally leaving her body, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "But I will be." In the days that followed, a new rhythm began, slow and deliberate. It was the rhythm of rebuilding, of healing. They worked side by side, mending the section of fence that had burned, clearing the ash from the porch, their movements a silent conversation that spoke volumes more than words could. The wild, desperate passion that had been forged in violence and fear now softened, deepening into a powerful, unshakable intimacy. A shared glance across the small cabin held more meaning than a lover's sonnet. A brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of coffee sent a current of warm, possessive electricity through her entire body. Community, once silent whispers on the wind, began to reach out. The blacksmith's wife appeared one morning with a basket containing a fresh loaf of bread, a jar of milk, and a small knitted blanket for the baby. She didn't ask questions, just pressed the basket into Elara's hands with a look of quiet respect. The preacher came by, not to preach, but to help Jedediah rehang the cabin door, which had been damaged in the fight. Word had spread, not of a victim, but of a survivor, of a fighter. One evening, after a long day of work, as she was cooking their meal over the hearth, Jedediah came to stand behind her. He didn't speak, just wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid, warm chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath a warm caress against her skin as he watched the food sizzle. "I never knew," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that resonated through her back and into her heart, "that silence could be so full. Before you, it was just empty." She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. This was real. More real than any pretty promise Silas had ever spun. This was a love born of fire and ice, a bond forged in shared trauma and tested by violence. It had not broken. It had been tempered into something stronger than steel. That night, after the baby was asleep in the cradle Jedediah had painstakingly sanded smooth for him, he didn't retreat to his chair. He came to her cot. He didn't loom over her, but knelt on the rough floorboards beside her, bringing them eye to eye. He took her hand in his calloused fingers gently intertwining with hers. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that made her tremble. He wasn't a man of easy words, and she could see the effort it cost him. "I don't have much to offer, just this land, these 2 hands, and a heart that was half dead until you and that boy washed up in the storm." He looked from her to the sleeping child, and his eyes shone with a fierce, protective light that was breathtaking. "I'm not asking you to be my wife because you owe me, or because it's the right thing to do. I'm asking." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "because without you, this cabin is just wood and nails. This land is just dirt. You are the fire in the hearth. You are the home." He didn't have a ring. He didn't have pretty words. He had the undeniable truth in his eyes, and the unwavering strength of his soul. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers tracing the rugged line of his jaw, the slight roughness of his evening stubble. "Jedediah," she whispered, her own voice breaking with the force of her feelings. She pulled him closer, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was not gentle. It was fierce, hungry, and deeply possessive. A culmination of all the fear, the desperation, the fight, and the wild, untamable love that had grown between them in this crucible of a winter. It was a kiss that sealed a promise made not with words, but with shared survival and a savage, unwavering devotion. Her answer wasn't just yes. It was everything. Spring eventually crept into the valley, peeling the deep snow back from the edges of the world like a careful seamstress, revealing new life. The trees, though bearing the dark scars of fire, budded with a defiant, vibrant green, and the sound of a baby's laughter began to echo in the small, warm cabin. Alara found that the woman who had collapsed in the snow, a ghost surrendering to the cold, was a stranger to her now. She had been forged into someone new in the crucible of that winter, shaped by terror and tenderness, by violence and a wild, all-consuming love. She learned that true strength isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand and fight in spite of it. And she learned that true love isn't about being saved by a knight in shining armor, but about finding the one person who sees the warrior in you, hands you a weapon, and stands beside you, ready for the battle. Jedediah didn't just wrap her in his coat to save her from the cold. He saw the fire within her and gave it a home, a place to burn brightly and without fear. Theirs was a story written in snow and ash, a fierce and beautiful testament to the fact that even in the harshest wilderness, the most beautiful and untamable things can grow. Thank you for joining us for this tale from the Untamed West. If you enjoyed our story, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with a friend, and subscribing to Wild West Stories for more.